I am your MC today. My name is Muhammad Yassin. Although I'm not from this university, I'm from Sydney University. It's still quite an honour to be your MC today. As you know, today's event is going to be a large sort of keynote part of WSU's Islamic Awareness Week, and the sort of keynote event of what has otherwise been a fantastic week of conversations and robust discussion. Before getting into more details, we'll start off with a Quran recitation, after which we'll swiftly move into the note.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم أم تأمرهم أحلامهم بهذا أم هم قوم طاغون أم يقولون تقوله بل لا يؤمنون فليأتوا بحديث مثله كانوا صادقين أم خلقوا من غير شيء أم هم الخالقون أم خلقوا السماوات والأرض بل لا يوقنون أم عندهم خزائن ربك أم هم المسيطرون أم لهم سلم يستمعون فيه فليأت مستمعهم بسلطان مبين أم له البنات ولكم البنون أم تسألهم أجرا فهم من مغرم مثقلون أم عندهم الغيب فهم يكتبون أم يريدون كيدا فالذين كفروا هم المكيدون أم لهم إله غير الله سبحان الله عما يشركون. Or do their minds command them to say this, or are they trying to disgracing people? Or do they say he has made it up? Rather, they do not believe. Then let them produce a statement like it if they should be truthful. Or were they created from nothing? Or were they the creators of themselves? Or did they create the heavens and the earth? Rather, they are not certain. Or have they the depositories containing the provision of your Lord? Or are they the controllers of them? Or have they a stairway into the heaven upon which they listen? Then let their listeners produce a clear authority. Or has he daughters while you have sons? Or do you, O Muhammad, ask of them a payment, so they are by debt or burdened down? Or have they knowledge of the unseen, so they write it down? Or do they intend a plan, but those who disbelieve, they are the object of a plan? Or have they a deity other than Allah, exalted is He, above whatever they associate with Him?
Thank you very much for that recitation. So I'll just have a quick spiel in terms of the purpose and the objectives of the event, and sort of we'll get right into it. Obviously, it's a discussion or a debate upon Islamic atheism, and really our objective here is to create conversations that matter, conversations that sort of are important and we don't often get the chance to discuss in our day-to-day busy lives, and sort of coming today to have this discussion and sort of get to the meat of where all of this disagreement lies. Obviously, much back and forth already exists on this topic. Much ink has been used in talking about this, but ultimately there's one answer, and sort of the answer to this question has a big impact on how we live our lives, and how we go about pursuing virtue ultimately. Just quickly, before I introduce the structure, just some housekeeping rules. Toilets are outside, and if you walk to your left, you'll find your toilets. And apart from this, the evening will go as such. Each side will have 20 minutes to present their main presentations, an opening presentation. after which we will have a 15-minute rebuttal by both speakers. After that, we'll have a short, very short, because we're running short on time already, break for refreshments, and then a rigorous cross-discussion, and a meaty 30-minute Q&A session. To introduce the speakers, on my left, we have Thomas Cox, a recent Macquarie University graduate with a Bachelor of Science Majoring in Environmental Science with a minor in philosophy. He was a president of Macquarie University's Atheist and Secular Society for 3 years and still continues to take part in a number of debates and talks with other atheist and religious groups across New South Wales. Besides this, Thomas is also a proud father and a car and podcast enthusiast. Our second speaker, to my right, is Brother Abdulah Hamimi. Abdullah has studied a Bachelor of Global Studies and Philosophy of Religion at Monash University. He currently holds a respected position of Australian Head of iERA and is a board member for Pillars of Guidance Community Centre. Besides dawah and community work, his interests include gym, reading, and fried chicken. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Abdullah to present the case for Islam or for God, and we'll go from there.
I've got a microphone.
Okay, sorry.
So I'll just get straight into it because I know we're running a little bit behind schedule. So I'd like to begin with the Islamic greetings of peace. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Now, essentially, the debate, tonight's debate is titled, Does God Exist? Islam or Atheism? So essentially, which one makes more sense? And I'm going to argue that if we use our reason and our rational faculty alone, that God certainly makes more sense. And definitely, Islam makes more sense. And atheism merely negates the given answer but fails to answer the question. Now, I'm going to make two simple arguments to validate that claim. And that firstly, Islam makes more sense of the origins of the universe. And secondly, that the Islamic conception of God follows directly from this. Following from this, I'd like to, if there's time, to touch on some of the philosophical underpinnings of atheism to demonstrate how there are questions and issues faced by atheism that demands answers. And if the proponents indeed have anything to do with reason, these answers should be forthcoming tonight. So firstly, let's start with some groundwork. Before we enter the debate, it's important that in order for us not to be talking past one another, that we have a mutual objective axiom to have this conversation. So again, I'll propose, surprise, surprise, the yardstick to employ in this discussion is to be reason and our rational faculty alone. And why? Basically because it's a universal axiom and we can utilize this in ultimately any debate. And it's about employing strong logic, reason, and critical thinking to arrive to a convincing conclusion. So let's begin with the first one, the first argument, that Islam makes the sense of the origins of the universe. Now, we've all heard these questions. Why does the universe exist? Why is there something rather than nothing? Now, these questions in relation to God have been very much been on the agenda these days, and scientists have made sure of it by publishing many books, book after book. Francis Collins, The Language of God, Richard Dawkins, The God Delusion, Victor Stenger's God, The Failed Hypothesis, and it goes on and on. And some of these books have become runaway bestsellers. And if I got the blog right, Mr. Cox's blog, yeah? You have a blog or a website?
Yep.
I saw a website for the Atheist Society, I think it was. Anyway, there's a whole list of these books as well.
Yep.
And so some of these books have become runaway sellers, and people obviously want to hear about what scientists have to say. Yeah, and this is not surprising, for science has immense cultural and intellectual authority in our sophisticated modern world. So one book which I'd like to particularly focus on is that of the late the late Stephen Hawking's book, The Grand Design. And by the way, despite the title, the contention of the book is to deny the existence of a grand designer. Now, the reason why I want to walk through Hawking's thinking is because I want to avoid characterizing this discussion by the typical militant new atheist type rhetoric of the likes of Dawkins and Hitchens. I want to have a really nuanced discussion, one where we can genuinely use our reasoning and rationality in this conversation, as opposed to projecting ideology. And particularly as opposed to projecting ideology. Because, as we'll understand, that we don't want to be preferencing certain explanations over others. That is essentially projecting ideology, and that would be speaking past one another. I want us to engage on the topics, on the information and the evidence presented, and really critically analyse that. And of course, the underpinnings of the scientific method are philosophical underpinnings of it. They are philosophical assertions, and for that reason require explanation or validation why that's being taken over certain other explanations. So, for example, the scientific method being underpinned by materialism, essentially that nothing else exists in the world except for matter. Naturalism, the idea that only natural laws are the rules that govern the structure and the behaviour of the universe. Empiricism, the only way to, and collectively, with materialism, naturalism, and empiricism, taking that as ideology in the form of scientism. Now that's something I want to unpack and address, but I don't want to jump the gun. Nevertheless, but let's park that for now. And so, essentially, there shouldn't be a reason why there should be no rational reason why the supernatural should be a last resort. The supernatural, after all, is simply that which is extra-spatial, extra-temporal, that is beyond space and time, which define the natural world. Now, I want to avoid ideology being passed as science, and particularly ideology being passed as cosmology. And so, this is expanded upon in many places, and I found in the New Scientist magazine in January, I think it was 2012, and it quotes, over the years, cosmologists, in brackets, have tried on several different models of the universe that dodge the need of for a beginning, while still requiring a Big Bang. Now, according to Hawkins, it is the law of physics, not the will of God, that provides the best explanation as to how the universe came into being. Now, the Big Bang, he argues, was the inevitable consequence of these laws, because there is a law such as gravity. The universe can and will create something, create itself from nothing, end quote. And then he opens a list of big questions or people have asked. Questions like, how do we understand the world? How does the universe behave? Where did this all come from? Did the universe need a creator? And these are really profound metaphysical questions. And perhaps ironically, in referring to this list of questions, he writes, and I quote, "Traditionally, there are questions for philosophy. But philosophy is dead. It has not kept up with modern developments in science, particularly in physics. As a result, physicists and scientists have become the bearers of the torch of discovery in our quest for knowledge." Now, despite this statement about philosophy itself being a philosophical statement, not one of science, it's a metaphysical statement about science. So the statement that philosophy is dead sort of contradicts itself fundamentally. And so the statement that scientists have become the bearers of and the torches of discovery smacks of scientism, that the only credible source of knowledge is through the scientific method. So basically, ideology passed as science. So how can we understand the origins of the universe? Bertrand Russell, the grandfather of neo-atheism, says, "The universe is just there. It's a brute fact. The implication of such claims is that the universe is eternal, and that it therefore implies that it has an infinite past. Can we have an infinite past? And can the infinite make sense in the real world?" Of course, according to Aristotle, a long time ago, the infinite is potential and never actualized. According to Aristotle, actual infinites, quantitative in the real world, cannot exist because they are paradoxical. It is impossible to say that you can always take another step and add another member in a completed step with a beginning and end, unlike a potential infinite. It is ultimately Aristotle's rejection of the actual infinite that allowed him to refute Zeno's paradox. So let's introduce this first argument. It's a deductive argument, a conclusion that necessarily follows from its premises, and denying a valid and sound deductive argument is equivalent to denying reality itself. So, let's begin. First premise, an actual infinite cannot exist. an infinite history of past events is an actual infinite. Therefore, an infinite history of past events cannot exist. Therefore, the universe is finite. Therefore, the universe had a beginning. And as we know this through the vast array of cosmological evidence also, that the universe had a beginning. And cosmologist Alexander Vilenkin said in a symposium marking Hawkins' 70th birthday, quote, "It suggests that the universe is not eternal, resurrecting the thorny question of how to kickstart the cosmos without the hand of a supernatural creator." And if we know that the universe had a beginning, well then there are only 4 logical explanations to how the universe came to be. Either the universe came from nothing, it created itself, it came from something created, or it came from something uncreated. They're the only 4 options. So let's discuss this together. How could the universe be created from nothing? And so, of course, what do we mean by nothing? And essentially the basic definition of that is the absence of something. Because we know the universe did not exist and it came into being. It would be absurd and irrational to suggest that it came from nothing and to argue that even on empirical grounds. So we'll talk about how one of the ideas that became popularized about this idea of nothing, a universe from nothing, literally titled Lawrence Krauss's book, is that essentially linguistic gymnastics, redefining what nothing is. Now, if you ask somebody what nothing is, it's a pretty simple definition. And if you were to redefine nothing that assumes a quantum vacuum being nothing, which is not nothing, of course it's something, it's a thing. It has a fluctuation of energy, it occupies space, it has laws of the universe. So it's most definitely a thing. And so Lawrence Krauss's nothing presupposes a something. And so really, what his book should be is a universe from something, in which case we wouldn't have any disagreement. Now Hawkins says that the existence of gravity means the creation of the universe is inevitable. But how did gravity come to exist in the first place? Gravity is a thing. What was the creative force behind its birth? Who put it there? With all its properties and potentials for mathematical description in terms of law. Besides, and most obviously, theories and physical laws do not bring matter or energy into existence. They are descriptive and not predictive, and they're not creative in actualizing. So the next scenario is, could the universe, and I think that takes care of the contention of, for the most part, that the universe coming out of nothing or something coming out of nothing is totally absurd. So the next scenario is, could the universe create itself? Now, in order for something to create itself, it needs to exist to create itself and not exist in order to be created. So it's a simple absurdity. So that just is a rational logical contradiction. That just can't, it cannot physically and philosophically happen. So, or could the universe be created from something else created? Meaning that, could the universe be a result of another universe, for example? Universe A is because of universe B, because of universe C, because of universe D, ad infinitum. If there was an infinite chain of dependent events or causes, then each one would be depending on another forever, and would never have the universe we exist in. But we know that we do have something. There is a universe in existence, our one. And so the problem of the infinite regress makes this impossible. And so I will argue that the final possibility is that the universe was created by something uncreated. And it's the most rational explanation and makes the most sense. So what does this mean? If anything exists at all, there must be something preceding it that always existed. Either God or the universe. And since we demonstrated that the universe began, therefore it could not have always existed. Now, if we continue this line of reasoning using our intellect, and this is something that the Quran makes very, very clear. It says, أَفَلَا تَعْقِلُونَ, that do you not use your intellect. It encourages mankind to reflect and utilizes rational faculty in appreciating the divine reality. So let's take these steps one more time. premise number one. An uncreated creator must be eternal by definition because he's uncreated, right? An uncreated creator must be eternal by definition because he is uncreated. He also must be transcendent, distinct and disjoint from the universe. Creating the universe does not imply that he becomes the universe. And the uncreated creator must have a will because the universe came into being. He chose the universe to come into being. And a choice indicates a will, and will indicates a relationship with sentient beings in the universe. And of course, it must be powerful. A good demonstration of that is simply by looking at part of his creation. If we were to split an atom, it creates an atomic bomb. And so it must be incredibly powerful if the universe is created from matter. And it must also be perpetually knowing. If it was created the law of gravity, for example, it must have intelligence, and intelligence implies knowledge. And so finally, he must be one. And the reason why we affirm his oneness, and particularly in the Islamic theological position, is that we can look at this from many ways. If we were to take a principle from the scientific method, Occam's razor, and it essentially says that the most simplest but the most comprehensive explanation is the best explanation. So one God is the best explanation because multiple gods would imply co-eternal wills and raises more questions than answers. Of course, with many other digressions. And so we can confidently conclude that what the Quran concluded 1400 years ago in chapter 112. قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ اللَّهُ الصَّمَدُ لَمْ يَلِدْ وَلَمْ يُولَدْ وَلَمْ يَكُنْ لَهُ كُفُوًا أَحَدٌ. Say God is one. He is eternal. He begets, nor was he begotten. And there is nothing like unto him. So to recap, we can affirm very confidently, based on evidence on multiple levels, on rational and grounds of reason and logic, as well as lived experience and scientific affirmation, that the universe came into being. And if the universe came into being, we essentially have to explore the cause, or the nature of that cause. And there could only be four possibilities: that the universe came out of nothing, came out of being into nothing, out of nothing. The universe always existed. The universe created itself, or was created by something uncreated. And by going through a process of logical deduction, we can explore each and unpack each possibility and affirm the remaining possibility, which is that the universe must have came into being from a cause that must necessarily be uncreated in order to avoid an infinite regress, because we have something. So that cause is by definition uncreated, and if it was uncreated, it must also contain other properties. Yeah, and so it must be independent because there was nothing else. It must also have omnipotent and power because it brought the universe into being. It must be it's not independent, so it doesn't depend on anything else. It must also have a will because the universe came into being. It must also have intelligence because it's a lawgiver, and we know there's laws in the universe, and a law implies intelligence. And so all these properties are essentially purely from logic and reasoning. A series of reasoning that I've just demonstrated in the last over the last 10 or 15 minutes. And so, from the Islamic point of view, we can affirm this through very strong evidence. Now, on the point of view of the philosophical underpinnings of the, because I've still got a little bit of time. Awesome. So on the philosophical underpinnings of the scientific method. Now that's something I think we can explore a little bit more because, and of course, depending on the contentions that are raised. And one thing that I want to shed light on and perhaps avoid is allowing that ideology of scientism under the guise of rational thought, unpacking that. And now we know that the scientific method, and one of the contentions raised by new atheists is essentially that, and I can use this as a rebuttal time because I've got a couple of minutes, if I'm allowed, is that the scientific method is the only method or the best method to find to arrive to truth, absolute truth. And if we can appreciate that the scientific method has got philosophical underpinnings of its development in terms of being advocates of naturalism, empiricism, and also what's the other one?
Materialism.
And materialism. Yeah, thank you. You know what you're talking about. Exactly. And so, if we're taking certain viewpoints on how the world is constructed, and that's going to essentially, in a way, bias our investigation by preferencing certain causes over others. So, if the scientific method, by definition, is built off naturalism, then by definition it cannot accept a supernatural cause. And that's fine. For a Muslim, I see no conflict between the method of inquiry. That method of inquiry is constructed by certain parameters. And I'm comfortable with conclusions that method of inquiry can arrive to. Fully cognizant why that's the case, right? And so there isn't any conflict on that epistemological level, because they're fundamentally, not fundamentally, in many ways they are different ways of inquiry, at looking at phenomena and understanding the world around us. And so maybe we can explore that in the rebuttal. But thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll just get straight into talks.
Hey everyone, thanks for coming. I do agree that this is an important discussion and appreciate the opportunity to be here and talk about this. So the debate topic is, does God exist? And Abdullah over here has the unfortunate position of being in the affirmative camp, and that means he has to provide convincing evidence that God does exist. And while it might seem, on the other hand, that I have to convince you that God does not exist, that is in fact not the case. The negative merely has to hold the position that the affirmative's case is unsubstantiated. And I merely have to bring the arguments into question. And this is a position of myself and most atheists. It's not that we believe without a doubt that God does not exist, but that at this point we lack the evidence required to believe. It's probably the same as you feel about the seventh dimension or Bigfoot or an invisible gardener. I found reading religious books that there's quite a lot of parables, so I've decided to bring a parable of my own from John Wisdom and Anthony Flew. So once upon a time, there's two explorers who come across a clearing in the jungle. In the clearing, there were many flowers and many weeds, and one explorer says to the other, "Some gardener must tend this plot." The other disagrees. There is no gardener. So they pitch their tents and set a watch. No gardener is ever seen. "But perhaps he's invisible," says the believer. So they set up a barbed wire fence, they electrify it, they patrol it with bloodhounds. But no shrieks ever betray an intruder, no movements of the wire ever betray an invisible climber. The bloodhounds never cry, and yet still the believer is not convinced. But maybe the gardener is invisible, intangible, insensible to electric shocks. A gardener who has no scent and makes no sound. A gardener who comes secretly to look after the garden which he loves. So it doesn't matter how much one looks and tests, a believer could always insist that a gardener or a god lies out there somewhere. But that's precisely my point. The onus is not on the non-believer to disprove the gardener, but on the believer to prove the presence of the gardener. So throughout tonight, I will not be attempting to disprove God, merely to ask whether or not the arguments presented by Abdullah are sufficient to believe. This topic is very broad, and I don't have a chance to necessarily preempt the arguments that are going to be presented. I look forward to addressing some of those in the cross. There's certainly a lot of good ones to cover. But instead, what I'll talk to you about is the idea of God and existence, two terms at the very heart of this debate. And so what is God? As the poster suggests, we're talking about the capital G God, the God of monotheism, particularly the God of Islam. We're not talking about Mithra, Buddha, Vishnu, Thor, or any of the other variety of gods. We're talking about the monotheistic God, and that has a unique set of characteristics. It isn't just more powerful, it's omnipotent. It isn't just more wise, it's omniscient. It isn't bound by time or space. He's omnipresent and he's omnitemporal. And we're also told he's most merciful and just, omnibenevolent, unmoved, unbound by physical and logical laws, necessary, the creator of all things, the eternal life giver and taker, the master planner, the sustainer, with no equal, beyond all others and beyond comprehension. It is said that only a God of this magnitude is worthy of the title. But what do all these things mean? And are they even coherent? God is said to be most merciful, and yet he would damn people to eternal damnation for lacking belief or having certain thoughts. What could be less merciful than eternal damnation, particularly for things beyond your control? But perhaps it's just. I don't think it is, but let's pretend it's how things ought to be. How then is God merciful? Isn't mercy the recognition that one deserves punishment, but forgiving them anyway? Either God puts them in their proper place, hell, justice, or he puts them in a place they do not deserve, mercy, injustice. We're also told that God is most good, that all good comes from him, yet he too is the creator of all things evil. And not accidentally, mind you, he is omniscient after all. It's all part of his plan. The source of all evil, and yet we would call him wholly good. How can we say one is omnibenevolent when all evil comes from them and is acted in accordance with their will? This is not consistent or coherent. We're also told that God is omnipresent, but not so present that we can see or feel him, that he exists outside of space. But what does it mean to be omnipresent if not in space? How can one be everywhere but not in space? Another one, he's eternal but exists outside of time. He exists throughout all of time, but outside of time. If in fact one exists outside of space and time, how can they even be said to exist at all? What does it mean to exist, if not to exist in space and time? If I existed in time but not in space, would you say that I exist? If I existed for 1 minute nowhere, would you say that I existed? Of course not. But maybe God is like math. Maybe he exists regardless of space and time. But math exists precisely because it is bound by other things. It is in the logic, the order, the laws of math or gravity that these things exist. God exists outside these things. What does it mean to exist without boundaries? To exist without boundaries is the same as not existing at all. It is precisely our boundaries, descriptions, our limitations which define our existence. And what does it mean to believe in something that's beyond comprehension? Can you say with confidence that you believe in fleebles, a word I just made up, that you don't even understand? That maybe you'll never understand if I refuse to explain it to you? And maybe I can tell you that you don't need to understand it to believe in it, but what kind of belief would that be, if it was belief at all? Each and every one of these characteristics that are used to describe God are unheard of in almost anything else. A being with even just one of these characteristics would carry a huge burden of proof. But here we have a thing which is exclusively defined by unheard of characteristics. A being which would be the most extraordinary possible, or, as the case may be, impossible. And I say it's almost unheard of in anything else because there's one thing which shares many of these characteristics, and that is nothing. And I understand it might seem funny that I'm equivocating in using that term, using it simultaneously to mean no thing and the idea of nothing. But in many ways I mean it in both senses of the word. It is clear that no thing is omniscient and omnibenevolent, etc. And this fact means that it's incredibly hard to prove God. But I also mean it as nothing. What could we say about the idea of nothing? Nothing is eternal and omnipresent. It's eternal because nothing cannot not exist. In its very non-existence it exists, and always has. It is simultaneously everywhere and nowhere, just like God. Nothing exists outside of space and time. To exist in time, it would have to have existence, like a second does. To exist in space, it could be detected or felt. It would be something. Nothing is intangible. Nothing is invisible, beyond measure and beyond comprehension. Nothing is not bound by logic or limits. To be bound, it would be something like math or language, but nothing has no boundaries. Nothing has no creator, and nothing is unmoved. We're told that everything is contingent upon other things, that a leaf is contingent upon its cells, which are contingent upon its atoms, its quarks, etc. But nothing is not contingent upon anything. Just like God, it simply is or isn't. Of course, this doesn't work for everything like mercy or goodness, and we can get to those characteristics later, but what does it mean that God shares so many characteristics with nothing? And what is God? This is precisely what the skeptic asks at the end of the parable. He asks, what remains of the gardener? How does what you call an invisible, intangible, eternal, elusive gardener differ from an imaginary gardener, or even no gardener at all? Again, I'm not saying this proves he doesn't exist, but it does make one wonder if the concept of God is cohesive, and if so, how one could ever reasonably show him to exist. So let's see if God could not exist. Let's start, as we do with all other things, not believing. The null hypothesis. We're talking about science. It's the idea in epistemology, statistics and science that you assume a default position of not believing in the presence of a phenomena or an entity to test your theory. You presume that any effect is not the result of the pill you've given, but the result of other normal behaviours unrelated to the entity, the pill that you're studying. That it could be explained by some other mechanism. Usually, you need to prove that it couldn't be explained by any other mechanism to a degree greater than 95%. And that's a good starting point. Then you have to repeat that experiment, increase that certainty to in excess of 98%. And that's just to see if a pill works. It isn't something as extraordinary a claim as God. That's just for a pill. So let's take the null hypothesis with God. What would we expect to see in a world without God? I posit to you that it would look exactly like this world. We would have good people and bad people in the world. We'd have other evils like cancer, because there is no creator, there is no justice built into the world we see. Bad things would happen to those good and bad people at equal rates. Churches and mosques like Notre Dame and Al-Aqsa would catch fire, collapse from earthquakes, and be struck by lightning at rates equal to other equivalent buildings. Religious people would have their prayers answered as much as I have my wishes answered, and they'd get cancer at equal rates too. We would expect the vast majority of the universe not to accommodate life, and indeed even the planet where life exists would not be wholly hospitable to that life. It'd be uncomfortable. And we'd expect to see errors in design, and we see that. Human knees are terrible. We have blind spots in our eyes, we retain useless tailbones, spend a third of our life unconscious and vulnerable, and have organs like the appendix and tonsils which pose more problems than features. And this is just us. We also see whales with hip bones, trees which are green, reflecting the majority of the sun's energy. Our food we've extensively modified for consumption, corns, tomatoes, carrots, cows, bananas, chickens. All these things are far more abundant, far more successful and designed than ever before. Far from a perfect world, even us humans have improved upon it. Where some look at a clearing, the flowers and the weeds, and see an organised garden, the likes of which could only come from a gardener, I see a jungle. I see the weeds and the flowers, just as one would expect without a gardener. And I could go on and on, because like I said, I don't think there is a single thing in this world which could only be explained by God. Every single observation is possible under the null hypothesis. And in science and epistemology, if you cannot disprove the null hypothesis, one is forced to admit that the entity or phenomena is not likely to exist. Not disproven, but unproven. And I don't think we'll ever know with certainty, but what about the concept of God itself? Where could that have come from, if not divine revelation? Could it be that God came about in much the same way as the gardener? That people came across a clearing in a jungle, saw plants, and assumed a gardener. Every plant must have a planter, right? That people saw thunder and proclaimed that must come from a god, and we'll call that Thor. Could it be like every other religion, that Allah is a result of the human need to explain the world? Not just scientific facts. I mean, we've also seen God's used to explain moral problems, to give us purpose, provide promise or threat of an afterlife. But these gods die out and fade into obscurity, because we find out that friction is the cause of lightning, and these religions become refined. The Pope now accepts evolution. For centuries, the concept of evolution was understood to be incompatible with Christianity, yet now they can coexist. The Garden of Eden, the flood, these things were thought to be literal for millennia, at least in Christianity. Now largely thought of as a metaphor. So as time goes by, the gardener becomes invisible, unsmellable, intangible. He loses so much of that original shape, he seems to resemble nothing at all as the believer struggles to maintain faith. And similarly, gods that are wrathful, angry, unjust, or stupid did not survive. Those religions died out too. And so we see the idea of God evolving over time. We see the Christian God becoming less about fire and brimstone to the modern concept of Jesus as love thy neighbour and repent and ye shall be forgiven. God becomes omnibenevolent. He becomes merciful while still struggling to hold on to this idea of justice and fairness. God evolves to fit the culture and the needs of the people just as the gardener did. The gardener is still said to love the garden, and we can imagine him being considered good and just to those animals as well. We still see religions arising and changing today. Countless cult leaders develop large followings, some of which proceed long after their deaths and turn into religions. I think that's what we're seeing with Mormonism, with Baha'i and Scientology. And many of these religions have beautiful books with historical knowledge, scientific facts, profound philosophy, prophecy, and miraculous claims, yet they are all man-made. And perhaps Islam is the most scientific, the most philosophical and beautiful of all these religions. But can we discount the possibility that this is just the best iteration of the imagined gardener? You need to ask if it is more reasonable that God came about through the same way as these other gods, or more reasonable that he actually exists. You need to ask if you can comprehend God, let alone whether or not he actually manifests in reality, exists in some sense of the word. And I'll never convince you that he doesn't exist. I'm not trying to. But if that is a possibility, that he could not exist, then you cannot reject the null hypothesis. You cannot say with certainty that God exists. How am I doing for time?
You got 5 minutes.
Okay, cool. So that's what I had written down. Would you want to? We'll just extend the next section.
Yeah.
I'll just leave it there.
Okay, easy. Okay. Thank you very much for both sides in your opening. We'll do the rebuttals now. Originally I had cut this down to 10 minutes, but because you finished a bit earlier, I think we can have 15 minutes per. So I'll start with the rebuttal from Abdulah, and then so 15 minutes from now. I'll give a knock at 2 minutes.
I'd like to thank Mr. Cox for that somewhat religious sermon. It sounded something out of something you'd hear at a Macquarie church, I think. Telling a parable of an attempted historical walkthrough of the construction of religion. Again, as I said at the beginning of my presentation, I really want to have a nuanced discussion and actually engage with the content, actually engage with the argument presented. Yeah, this is the whole point of this debate, right? It's not if we're here to tell stories and just give our personal opinions on things probably wouldn't be at a university setting. Or the objective here is to engage with arguments. Now I've presented an argument that is a millennium and a half probably old. That's been originally developed by Muslim theologians and then of course utilized by Christian theologians as well. And that argument is a very rational and logical explanation for the existence of us and the existence of the universe. That there was a cause for the universe, and that cause is, by necessity, must have certain attributes. And we don't have to call that God. We just simply have to, we can simply affirm that there was a cause for the universe, and this cause has those attributes. And all I demonstrated in my presentation was that this cause, and the attributes that this cause has by necessity, through rational deduction, coincide with the Islamic understanding of God. And so therefore it follows. To quote the Pope, Scientology, reference Mormonism, reference other religions, it's all red herrings, right? We're having an honest and discussion with integrity, and we're talking about evidence here. Yeah, we're a skeptic. I'll put the skeptic hat on as well. Yeah, let's engage with the content. Now, the argument that was presented was essentially a deductive argument that there's a cause to the universe, and that cause could only be explained through four possible explanations. And none of those explanations were engaged with. So you're here to, like, if you simply define yourself as a negation, imagine a negation to the affirmation of an idea, yeah? Imagine being an A-communist or an A-socialist instead of being a capitalist, yeah? Or an A-liberal instead of being a conservative. It sounds really silly, because it is, right? We're here to, if a contention is being made, there's an onus of proof to demonstrate that contention. Now, if Mr. Cox over here is making the contention that he just doesn't know, that's fine. That's fine. Just leave it at that. But if you're going to make if you're making a contention for example, a way of affirming, a way of looking at the world, and investigation, right? Referring to the scientific method or scientific developments as evidence, and then somehow marrying that with a parable of a garden. And I think there's a book by Dawkins called Garden Out of Eden, so it might be taken out of that as well. And then, if anything, the example of a garden probably is a pretty good explanation for the existence of a creator. You come into a manicured garden. What is the first thing you think about? Who did this? What a marvelous kind of work. Like, you'd be totally irrational to postulate that this garden just fell out of nowhere and just popped out of nowhere and just was so well manicured. Everything was in the right place, all diverse and functioned with such great beauty. But then it comes to the next point, is that of the limitations, or where the scientific method can't just doesn't apply. How can you make judgments on beauty and beauty, good or bad, based on science? The scientific method just isn't utilized for those judgments, right? So to have a beautiful garden, according to that worldview, doesn't exist anyway. It's just a garden, right? So a little bit of the emotional impact of that parable sort of doesn't make sense anyway. And there were sort of other contentions here that revolved around it. You mentioned the idea of he tried to make a parallel between the attributes of God and God being incomprehensible, and nothing also being incomprehensible. Let me comprehend nothing, right? It's the absence of something. It's comprehensible. We know exactly what nothing is, right? It's not. It doesn't have. It's literally nothing. If it had attributes, it would not be nothing, right? Just open up Oxford Dictionary. Look at nothing. Open up your the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. You'll get what nothing is. Please do that. So the parallel is really clutching at straws. Again, please engage with the content. If the universe has a cause, now let's try and understand that cause. Now, there was also an argument there made of defining certain characteristics of God. Now, this is totally ignorant of the Islamic theology. And the reason why I say this is because it sort of, from my understanding at least, his argument for the certain characteristics of God are used between atheist and Christian debates, for the most part, of God having certain distinct attributes. Now, in the Islamic perspective, for the Islamic theology, we have 99 names and attributes, and they're all known collectively through the oneness of God, right? And so, how do we explain the existence of certain realities in the world through the existence of God, right? We can know attributes of God rationally. The ones that I mentioned in my presentation: His omnipotence, His independence, His infinite nature, His will, and His intelligence. But there's nothing else we can't know that He is all merciful and all loving and all that sort of stuff from our reason and rational faculty. That's something that to know more about God, assuming He exists, of course, is through what He has communicated to us. So for Thomas to pull out attributes of God, where is he getting that from, really? And then landing conclusions from that. Also, fundamentally, how do we explain our own existence? How do we explain our own existence? How do we explain immaterial parts of our existence, such as our mind, our consciousness, our soul, for example, right? Materialism has no answers to that. If anything, it negates it. Yeah? And then, of course, there's a few other things that are in here. God potentially couldn't exist. Well, yeah, if you don't want to engage with the arguments, well then, yeah, you probably would have land that conclusion, right? You just don't know, and I think that's willful ignorance. It's not engaging with the content, and you know, let's give each other the academic integrity and honesty to engage with each other's content. So I'd really encourage Mr. Cox to do that, please. I don't know what else is there here. Reference to Pope, I don't know why. Is that relevant? Red herring again. Quoted Christian text of Jesus. I'm not sure. Last time I checked, this is a discussion about Islam. So all the other religions and the parable is a huge red herring. Like, if you know, the first thing I thought when I heard this was, this is a religious sermon under the guise of an atheist contention, more or less. Yeah. So you'd make a good priest of the Church of Atheism, with respect, of course. What else is there? How can God exist outside of time? How can God... okay, we'll touch on the problem of evil next, but yeah, how can God exist outside of time and outside of all these parameters? Again, if we engage with the content, I think this question is a non-question. The reason being is that we arrive that there must be a cause to the universe. Now, this cause must also have certain attributes, right? And so one of those attributes is timeless. It existed before anything. It's not bound by the parameters of its creation, time being a creation. Now, of course, there's different philosophies on theories of time as well, and we can go through that if he wishes as well. So for it to exist outside of time and space, well then, it makes sense, right? It totally makes sense. By definition, it has to. Any conception of God, or of this first cause, being in time, being in space, that's a debate that Muslims don't have to, Muslims have nothing to answer to that, because it just simply doesn't apply. That might be a point that you might have a discussion with Christians, for example, given that they believe that you know, Jesus existed in time and he was God and that sort of stuff, but that's not something. So I think we're mixing a few theologies here as well. The characteristics of God, again, not taken from the Islamic point of view, or understood from that, so again, misapplied. What else is there here? I've written this title like 4 times, doesn't engage with my content. How many minutes are? 5 minutes, yeah. And of course, finally he ended on, if God didn't exist, what would the world look like, right? Well, you would have a very difficult understanding of explaining the world in the first place, let alone making moral judgments or fundamental moral judgments of good or bad or beauty, yeah? Or meaning in general, right? You couldn't explain the existence of the universe. If we know that the universe came into being, and if God didn't exist, well, I'll leave that to your imagination, huh? Really, there's a lot of rhetoric involved in that, and I really want to get to the substance. So again, an appeal for Mr. Cox to engage with the fundamental philosophical and deductive arguments presented for the existence of God. And if we willfully ignore those, well, I can understand why the conclusion remains willfully sort of blindsided in many ways. I think there was one more thing that we touched on, because I've got a couple more minutes. I'm not trying to claim that the Islamic understanding of God is more scientific or in that way. I'm simply and purely demonstrating that it has a strong, rational, logical and philosophical basis. And if we all have a mind and intelligence and an ability to think and reflect, we can utilize that universal axiom, our human mind and our rationality, to come to a basic understanding of an existence of a creator. Now, I simply extracted characteristics and I demonstrated how they also lie parallel in the Islamic understanding, and therefore the Islamic understanding of God simply follows and is correct on that level. I look forward to engaging on this topic, right? If we can, so thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so 15-minute rebuttal.
Okay, a few things coming. So the topic of this debate is, does God exist? And we've got a lot of talking about the origins of the universe, and I'm not quite sure what the origins of the universe, that if we found the origins of the universe, is it enough just to say there is an origin and then to slap the God label on that origin? I mean, you can say after the fact that, oh, whatever that thing is, that is God. But that's not proving the existence of God, that's proving the existence of an origin of the universe and then just labeling that God. I'm also not sure Abdullah understood the parable. See, in the parable, it's not a garden they come across. They come across a clearing in a jungle. And it isn't well manicured. It has flowers and it has weeds. And to somebody like myself, somebody looking at what would we expect if there's no gardener, we would expect flowers and weeds. We expect jungles to occasionally have clearings. I just graduated doing my environmental science degree. There are clearings in jungles. And not because gardeners made those clearings, although if you look at what's happening with the Amazon and stuff like that, sometimes it is human-made. But these things happen naturally. In a world without God, you would expect there to be flowers. You expect there to be some order, but some disorder. The analogy often made is the watchmaker argument. This idea that if you look at everything you can tell is designed because it's like coming across a watch. It's so intricate, so well designed. Except the watchmaker argument fails to understand that everything is watches. In the traditional kind of idea that you're walking along a beach and there's a watch and you think the watch is this magnificent thing, but you're not walking along a beach and finding a watch. You're walking along a sea of watches, and among that sea of watches is another watch. What would it mean to say, look at the world, you can tell it's created, if you don't know what a not created thing looks like? Don't you need an example of something that's not created, something that's natural, of which to contrast a created thing? And under a religious worldview, you don't have that. We had this idea of look up the definition of nothing, and you'll find that it's comprehensible. You can do the same thing with Allah. You can do the same thing with God. You can look that up in a dictionary. It doesn't mean you can wrap your head around it. Not really. And if you think of nothing, I argue you haven't thought of nothing. Because to think of nothing is to think of something. It's not possible to not have anything. There's always this idea of why is there something rather than nothing? We look around at the world and we go, why is all this here? But nobody ever thinks to ask why there's not nothing. Maybe nothing can't be. Maybe there's no such thing as nothing. We had all this talk about the beginning of the universe and the Big Bang. And the way this is often misconstrued is that the universe appeared out of nothing. And that's not what the Big Bang says at all. In fact, it's quite a misnomer. It was called the Big Bang by a theist to mock the idea of it. But the person that originally came up with the idea just talked about the early stages of the universe. When you look back through all the radiation, back through space, and literally through space and time, you see everything coming together. And then you see this rapid expansion, and that's the Big Bang. It's not the beginning of the universe, but the early stages of what we can see at the very least. And there's a number of explanations for this. And I think to say, oh, I can't think of another explanation, or I think the only explanation could be God, is just a lack of imagination. nature and the universe has a far, far greater imagination than we can ever have. And I think it's the utmost arrogance to say that merely because we can't think of an explanation, that therefore it must be God. I don't think not knowing anything can ever be the basis of knowledge. What we're doing here is saying, I don't know or I can't think of, therefore, here is a thing I know. You can't get knowledge from a lack of knowledge. So alternatives to where the universe began. My favorite, and there's multiple, is that space and time is three-dimensional. See, if you're on a 2D plane, if you're on a ball, and you look across to the edge of the ball, it all seems to come together to a point. And that could be what we're seeing with the Big Bang. And it's not that there is a starting point. You can say, where is the beginning of the ball? You can say, as people did for millennia, where's the edge of the globe? There must be an edge. But that was just a lack of imagination. It could be that space and time, the universe, is infinite in our plane, in that it goes all the way around and back on itself. And then time is consistent and eternal in that sense. But you can also have the universe coming from the Big Bounce. I don't know if you guys know the Big Bounce. That's this idea that the universe expands, rapidly expands, and then the laws of physics change just as they did with the Big Bang, and then everything collapses back in on itself and then forms back into a singularity and goes again and again throughout all of time. And we can say it can't go on forever, but why not? The only reason we say these things is because of human understanding of infinity. The universe, particularly the stages of the universe, in the early stages and the stages of the singularity, don't follow any of the rules or common sense that we know now. There is actually no gravity. That's why Dawkins says it's something like gravity. There is no gravity in the early stages of the universe. It has completely different rules that we can't understand because we can't look back at it. It stops making sense to us. It defies all logic. Some other examples of where the universe came from, you have different multiverse theories. You have the simulation hypothesis, this idea that as civilizations get more intelligent, they start to make simulations of the universe to try and model out what happens. And of course, they don't just make one simulation, they make many simulations, billions of simulations, all of which have beings in them which think they're conscious, but aren't, not in, like a sort of matrix kind of scenario. And if there's billions of these simulations, what's more likely? That you're living in the simulation or that you're living in the one real world? What are my other ones for? Another one for the universe is perhaps we zoom in, and like Abdullah said, that everything is contingent upon something else. We see a leaf, and inside that leaf is cells, and inside those cells are atoms, and inside those atoms are quarks. And from that quark's perspective, the leaf is a universe. And it could be that that keeps going all the way down and all the way up. It could be that if you zoom out of our universe into our solar system, into our galaxy, that is the atoms that make up a larger universe. It's crazy scientific, sci-fi ideas, but this is the imagination that one lacks when one says the only explanation is God. So let's talk about the deductive side of things. The infinite cannot exist, from Aristotle. Famous for making a number of other errors and by no means an authoritative source. Infinities, in fact, do exist. You mentioned Zeno's paradox. Zeno's paradox is this idea that you shoot an arrow at somebody, and in half the distance it will take, let's say, 2 seconds. And then half the distance again is another second. And then half the distance again is a quarter of a second. And you can keep adding all those numbers together for infinity, and the arrow never reaches the person. And you can look at all the numbers between, well, you can look at all the numbers, that's infinity, but even the numbers between 0 and 1 are infinite. Infinities exist. And the universe is not defined and limited by our human imagination. The other thing is that, therefore, history cannot be infinite. And it might not be infinite. But it might be infinite. it. It might repeat all those times, like I said before. Or maybe it did just spring into existence in a universe where that kind of thing can happen. Like I said before, we've never seen a nothing. Could it be that there can't be nothings, that nothings always form into somethings, or that there was always somethings? Or it could be that the universe is infinite, but in that way that my ball scenario is infinite. The ball goes all the way round. Time goes all the way round and back on itself. It's not that it's infinite, but it's that it's bound in itself and it goes back on itself. So this conclusion that therefore the infinite is finite and had a beginning isn't necessarily true. Yeah. So this all began when we said that Islam makes sense of the universal origins. And that might be true. A lot of other religions also believe that their beliefs make sense of the origins of the universe. The person who believed in the invisible gardener, his belief made sense of the clearing in the jungle. You can posit a number of explanations that do fit and could work, but just because they can work, it doesn't mean they're the right fit. So you can imagine that you have a jigsaw puzzle, right? And that's all your knowledge, and there's gaps in your knowledge. And over time, we've filled in those gaps in our knowledge. Like flowers come from seeds and from spores and from bees spreading. But maybe once upon a time, we had this wrong puzzle piece there. We thought that it was gods that brought forth the flowers, or that it was fairies that did it. And those explanations can work. You can say that it's fairies that bring about flowers. It's internally consistent, but it's not the right answer just because it fits. And so we go about, and like I was explaining in my opener, the religions, some of them die out because we find the real puzzle piece. Some of them get molded so they don't interfere with things like evolution, which was my example with the Pope. Catholicism was coming into contention with evolution, which was increasingly becoming accepted as scientific fact. And so instead of fighting that fight, they've changed it so they can be compatible. But God isn't like a puzzle piece. He's more just like a piece of blue tack. He can fit as an explanation for anything. He did fit as an explanation for thunder. That is an explanation. But was it the right explanation? Like the gardener example, there's a clearing in the jungle. You can posit there's a gardener. That's valid, that's possible. I'm not saying it's impossible and that God definitely doesn't exist. But every single time we filled in one of those puzzle pieces, it's never been God. It's never been magic. It's never been anything supernatural. And it needs to fit with the rest of the picture. And religion tries to do that. It tries to colour the blue tack and make it fit with everything else. But like I said at the end, can we discount the possibility that this is just the best iteration of the garden? Just that this is not just the blue tack that has been best crafted and best coloured. We talked about how science can't accept the supernatural, and that what the supernatural is things that's outside of space and time, but it can. Science talks about things like mathematics and stuff like that, and I know we only understand that within space and time, but those things are not bound by space and time. Math is only bound by physics. It's not bound by space or time. I do think it's possible, though, that science can't talk about the supernatural, which is the things which can't be tested. There's a lot of scientists that argue that the multiverse theory is not a valid scientific theory because it can never be disproven. And I think that's also the case with the supernatural. The supernatural isn't something that can ever be said to be proven or disproven. It's that blue tack. You can't examine it. It always is unexaminable. But I think that's precisely why you should say that you don't know it to exist. And that's a position I have. And that's a position you should all have in this debate. The topic is, does God exist? And what we've been talking about is, does an origin for the universe exist? And I think that's irrelevant. I think that is a red herring. the question is, can we know God to exist? And I don't think we can ever demonstrate that. I don't think we have.
Thank you very much. Very robust, interesting discussion, to say the least. We're still sort of running short on time. I'm going to let you guys go for a short break. 7 minutes, so 7:40, if everyone can be back here, and then we will start the cross discussion. So 7:40, everyone please. Okay. That's good. Not allowed to no, don't do that. Yeah, exactly. And just say like having a God is still one of the laws of the universe. Like, yeah. Like each but I know it exists.
I don't want to touch the but there is a place where I make
What did you say about like I mean, you can get around like the same. Like you improvise with like so this could happen.
But there's one thing.
We'll aim to start in just 2 minutes, so if you could wrap up your discussion and conversations, we're going to start in 2 minutes. We'll be starting in just a minute, so please make your way back to your seats.
Read this long comment. Can I sit there? Yeah. Is it taken? Oh, yeah, no, this is not taken. You can see. Sorry, guys.
I was rushing to get here.
Yeah,
It's not like I was in the late lunch. And then, like, before I left, and then got caught in traffic on the way here.
What's your name?
NASA.
We're sending things to the room.
Yeah.
We're related. You must be looking for me. I'm running for something.
I know. It's like 15 minutes.
How was it so far?
Easily.
Well, you're not timing.
Yeah. I was trying to be here more time. And then, I
also because of my car separate has taken off your head. So I was when I came here, I had the whole like, are you going to be here on time? And I'm like, I'm going to be there.
You got a security license? Yeah, man. You do? Of course.
And also 20 years.
Yeah.
What's that page? What's that page, man? What's that page? It's okay, yeah, we should replace it. It's live. We should move this book. I can move this book. Habibi, can you please move this book?
Okay, we're going to start now. So, just people living at the back, if you could quickly sort of jump back to your seats.
I need something more. I need something more.
Okay, so what we'll do for this session is we'll have class discussion. How this will look like is I will pose questions that both speakers can sort of engage through. I will try my best to sort of let the details be teased out and not intervene as much. And hopefully that way we can sort of have some discussion going. After that, we'll have a short Q&A, and sort of I'll cue when that's to happen. So I'll start off with one of the first questions to Abdullah, and it sort of speaks to Thomas's concern that even if you had an origin of the universe, it seems like you've just slapped on the label of God. So what's the link between the origin of the universe and there being a God?
Okay, so with my initial presentation, I didn't want to necessarily use the word God. We were essentially describing a cause, and we could understand attributes or characteristics of that cause. And the reason why the origin of the universe is important is actually on many levels. Firstly being that it's essentially we're postulating whether a creator can exist, and if we can demonstrate a creator or a creator of the universe exists, that has huge. Not only does that also can be characterized as God in that conception. We can use that word, but I know sometimes when we have these discussions, it can be meant, it could be understood in a low different sort of way. So I try not to use that in the philosophical deduction. Now, if a God does exist, or if a first cause exists, this first cause has got certain attributes that would otherwise resemble the Islamic understanding of God. Well, there's huge ramifications here, right? It has ramifications around understanding where we came from, why we potentially answers of why we're here and what we're here for, right? And of course, and it can unpack it on other levels on, for example, how we live our life, and I really understand our positionality in this whole grand scheme of things. So to demonstrate, we understand the reason why I took this sort of road is because my contention is that the Islamic understanding of God is correct. And I want to demonstrate, and in the Islamic understanding of God, we understand him as the creator, as the first cause, right? And the first cause has to have all these attributes. And so therefore, we have to describe or try to comprehend that first cause. And there's certain basic attributes that we can comprehend, that is comprehensible by the human mind, at least on a broad level, and that's what I did. And so for that reason, it's incredibly important to engage with that point, right? God being, the Islamic understanding of God being eternal, uncaused, uncreated, has a strong relationship with that discussion that I brought in.
Just more specifically, though, could you address the sort of link between an origin of the universe, and if that's the case, and then how do you jump from? Because you spent time in your presentation laying out the fact that there had to be an origin. If there's an origin, like Victor Thomas is concerned that, what does that actually tell us about God specifically? If you could lay that out.
If there is an origin of the universe, that means there's a creator of the universe, yeah? And if this creator was intelligible, if this creator had a will, if this creator had all these attributes, that has huge ramifications in terms of where we are and how we understand our existence and the existence of the world around us. So this is deep philosophical questions that philosophers and people all particular atheists included, anyone asks themselves and seeks to comprehend, why is there something rather than nothing? Why is it that we exist here? And for what reason? Right? And we're postulating different contentions. So we really need to interrogate that initial discussion, right? If we assume a whole bunch of other things and then make contentions on that, just we can go from first principles right from the beginning, and I think that's really important in this discussion. When everyone who understands God, or most people, at least in the Islamic context, we understand God as the creator of the universe, and so I have to demonstrate. Yes, the onus of proof on that level is on us, on me, and that's what I did, and I felt that I did that coherently without any sort of deep interrogation, unfortunately.
Okay. So we have this idea that if there was a cause to the universe, that it must have certain attributes, and I think the one that I have the biggest contention with is will, and kind of this idea that then it is a being. We get told that then it must be a creator, and I suppose it created something, so it's a creator. But I think this is a sneaky way of smuggling in the idea that it is sentient. Earthquakes create mountains, and we can call the earthquakes creators, but the earthquakes didn't knowingly create a mountain. So that it's not necessarily that it has will, but even supposing it had will, there's a friend of mine. He's got, in his front garden, he has this old Ford truck. That truck was created to be driven around. And in his front garden, it's used as a flower bed. So, just because something is created with a certain thing in mind, it doesn't mean that would then define our purpose or the purpose of that truck. It could be used for whatever we wanted. But in this case, it's not even clear that the creator has a will. It's certainly at least not being made clear to me. I don't think it's being made clear from the universe either. We have this idea that different religions and different revelations have revealed to us what the will is, and it usually involves some sort of worship or giving to a temple or some sort of rules and guidelines or a prophet or some kind of power dynamic. But there's countless examples of what this is. And there's nothing in nature that actually orientates what that will is, at least not in the sense that we should worship. That isn't, you can't find that in nature somewhere. You only find that from the words of men.
Okay, would you like to respond to
will? So the will is essentially that the universe came into being. Something initiated. There was a cause to the universe. So therefore, it just translates that there was a will, right? There was a will. In terms of, so something happened, so something caused it. In terms of the earthquake and the car analogy, so if the car was not used for a purpose, well then it's not fulfilling its purpose, right? It can be used for anything. And the parallel here is that if there's a creator, and there's a creator to the universe, and the creator of mankind, only the creator can fundamentally determine the purpose, and if it's not being used for a purpose, it doesn't mean it can't be used at all, right? And I think that's where that truck analogy sort of falls apart. But on the will point of view, the whole point here is, just to recap one more time, is that we went from non-existence to existence. Yeah, something happened. It went from non-existence for eternity past, and it came into existence. Right? So something initiated it, something willed it to happen, and that's how we understand the idea of a will. If that makes sense.
Did you want to respond to that?
I'll let you move on if you want. I mean, I don't think that a mountain came into being that it necessarily follows that the earthquake had a will to create mountains. And in the same way, I don't think that if there was a creator to the universe, or a thing which created the universe, that it follows that that thing necessarily had a will. It might have even unintentionally caused the universe. Yeah, I'll just leave it there.
I'll sort of let you respond to, if you would like to, into the next question. So a lot of Thomas's argument in his presentation was about, in sort of referring to different theories that we could read into explaining the universe, is that as humans, our perspectives are very limited to make claims about God, and that we're just sometimes possibly not being creative enough in how we explain the universe, right? So maybe Will's an example of this, but more broadly, are we not being creative enough, or are we sort of trying to smuggle in the concept of God, sort of just to sort of have the concept of God there? Or is there sort of a more, so how would you respond to this contention that we're just not being creative enough in our theories?
How to respond to that? If there is a theory posited, and I think Mr. Cox brought up quite a few philosophical models, right? Without any substantiation or reasoning as to why they're true. Okay, this model exists and this model exists. Just dumping ideas doesn't necessitate evidence, right? Particularly philosophical models. What was the second part of the question?
So, as in, is it just the fact that we lack human knowledge, or like, do we just need to look further and wait longer before we can actually come?
So, on my discussion, and this is why I'm saying that we can use our logic and reason. It's not about how, right? In terms of the precise cosmological avenue of how the universe was created, right? It's about the why, right? And in understanding the why, we can understand the cause, and we can appreciate the nature of this cause, right? Because fundamentally, unless Mr. Cox is affirming that there is no cause to the universe, which I don't think he's doing, but maybe he can clarify, then he's got a lot to answer for that, right? There's a lot of points, a lot of cross questions that I could pose to that. And if the universe didn't have a cause, and if this cause was, it could only be one of those other three possibilities, that it came from nothing, it always existed, or it created itself. And we can know that they're rationally inconceivable. So what I'm describing here is something that we could all engage with, and we can all appreciate, not only from our human experience, but also from the knowledge around us, available in the many disciplines. Postulating specific or a bunch of competing ideas without any actual evidence to them goes against, I think, the principle of rationalism anyway, and is totally unscientific and purely philosophical in a not so coherent way. I think the term for it, one of the models that he used was solipsism. I think that's the word. Right? I think that's how you pronounce it. It's sort of self-defeating and circular. Anyway, if you want to present a model and present potentially answers rather than just dumping them, explain rationally why that is the case, right? Not just saying that, hey, there's this particular fancy model, scientific model, and there's this particular fancy scientific model, without explaining it. I haven't affirmed that this is the exact process of how the universe was created. I'm saying that there's a cause to the universe, yeah? And I think we sort of need to come down to that point a little bit more.
Yes, I'd actually like to bring it down to that as well. Like, in that, I feel like we sort of got caught up in the will without sort of dealing with the question that there was a cause to the universe, and so you can rebuke this if you'd like. And if there was, how do we actually go about explaining that?
Cool. So I obviously can't explain with certainty how the universe was created, but there's a number of possibilities I put forth, and I got a couple of other ones which I haven't mentioned yet. But I will just quickly touch on this idea that the first thing we're told in those series of premises for that deductive argument is that infinities can't exist. And so it almost immediately rules out one of the potential conclusions that it always existed. And I've already talked about how I think it could have always existed. But if infinities can't exist, and if things, therefore, by extension, can't be eternal, then why does that rule not apply to God? It's a very old counter-argument, but not one that I've ever heard a convincing response to. We just simply get this answer, He is God. And we can say the same thing about the universe, that the universe is infinite. It's always existed. Why? It's the universe. Like I said, my favorite one, and maybe I explained it poorly before, is the idea that we're like a dot on a basketball. So it's not that the universe is 3D, which is what I said before, but that if you consider the universe to be 5D, and we're bound in this 4-dimensional world, that would be equivalent to being a dot, 2D, on a 3-dimensional plane like a basketball. And the basketball to that dot is eternal. It goes all the way around. But that's only one possibility. And the reason why we might think that's possible is because we know about the 4 dimensions we have, you know, up and left, right, and time. And so we know that it's possible that other dimensions exist, and that from the perspective of one dimension down, that these things could seem eternal. But there's other ones. Another one of my favorite ones is this idea that universes come from white holes. So you have black holes, right, which absorb everything, right? But we also know that matter can't be created or destroyed, or at least that's a physics principle. So where does that matter go? There's an idea that those black holes birth new universes. And that's precisely why we see our universe with so many black holes, because you have almost an evolution effect happening with universes, that universes with black holes breed more universes. Another one, I talked about the big bounce. So we found out with the Big Bang that the thing that was causing the expansion, because we thought the universe was static, we thought it wasn't moving at all. And then when we thought it was growing, we thought it was growing at a steady rate. But we actually found out that the growth was exponential. And the cause of that was dark energy. It's almost like a negative gravity that pushes the universe apart. But there comes a time where that principle breaks down, where things become so distant from each other that, like gravity, they stop operating on each other. And at that point, there's an idea that there will be new universal principles like the weak nuclear force or something that then overtakes the force of the dark energy and pulls everything back together. So, I mean, I'm not a physicist. I can't go into all the depth and definitively prove any of these universal arguments, but there is evidence behind a lot of these different theories, and even if there wasn't, even if we couldn't think of another explanation, a lack of knowledge is never an excuse to posit knowledge, to posit another answer. You can't have knowledge coming from a lack of knowledge.
Okay, I'll split that up into two things, because firstly I want to sort of cover this contention, or like a common question in that, if, for example, we can't have infinities, why is it that God's infinite? Or why can't the universe be infinite? So if you respond to that first, and then we'll go to the other thing.
So I didn't say infinite and infinity can't exist. I said a quantitative infinite cannot exist. So what Mr. Cox is describing there is a qualitative infinite. And qualitative infinites, known through mathematics, are potentials that are never reached anyway. So I think that's mischaracterized. And if a quantitative infinite cannot exist, therefore an infinite chain of dependent events cannot exist. To ask the question of who created God, and it's classically, I think Richard Dawkins asked this really profoundly. The whole point is that God is uncreated, right? that the beginning of the universe starts somewhere. So I don't believe in a created God. So that question simply doesn't apply. Who created God, more or less, right? Who was before God? That the buck has to stop somewhere, and where that buck stops, that cause has to, by necessity, be uncreated, right? And so that question just simply doesn't apply in that form. And also, I'm not positing a God of the gaps, as in there's a lack of knowledge, therefore God. I've presented a coherent, deductive argument explaining a basic nature of this cause, which still hasn't been engaged with for some reason. So, if anything, Mr. Cox is positing a lack of knowledge through potential philosophical examples that he's not really presenting evidence for, or even closely attributing his contention with, just loosely dumping them there and saying that there is evidence without presenting any of it.
Okay, that sort of brings me to the second part, in that question to Thomas, in that Abdullah's argument seems like it's couched itself in premises that follow, and sort of you end up with a deduction, and you end up saying that because these options don't apply, this is why God exists. What it seems like to me, or sort of what Abdullah just said now, is that all the theories you've posited have been potentials, but you're not sort of giving us reasons to believe them. Why should we believe sort of what you're saying, or what Abdullah's saying, given some sort of rational deduction?
So the reason I'm not making a deductive argument is because I don't have a claim. I'm not the one here trying to convince you of a God or a gardener. As I said in my open, it's the person making the claim, making the argument, that has to do the proving. And so all I'm trying to do is posit alternatives and to poke holes in the argument that's being presented, because it's being posed as a deductive argument. And I agree, if a deductive argument and all the premises are sound, then the conclusion is a logical conclusion. But the whole argument revolves around this is the only possibility. And so that's why I'm talking about these other possibilities. I'm not here trying to present any particular one to you and say that's the definite one. I'm just trying to tell you there are other possibilities, because implicit in that argument is there are no other possibilities. And there are.
Just to speak to that.
Can I just ask a question?
Yep.
You, just for clarification's sake, are you, given that the debate here is Islam or atheism, are you making a contention on atheism or agnosticism? Just to clear up.
Both. So, I mean, you talked about asocialism and all these other things before. So the a prefix just means not in Latin. So you have theism, belief in God, and then you have atheism, not a believer in God. Similarly, you have Gnostic, which comes from the same root as the word knowledge. So a Gnostic is somebody who knows, and an agnostic is somebody who doesn't know. And so I am agnostic. I don't profess to know. But I'm also an atheist, which is somebody who doesn't believe. Doesn't mean that I reject God. It just means that I'm not a believer.
Just to sort of speak through in terms of positing alternatives, because it seems like Abdullah's argument rests on these possibilities, and you're saying these aren't the only possibilities, and you're presenting more. Abdullah, you can correct me on this, but it seems like Abdullah's saying that either the universe was eternal, and he's saying that because an infinite series of events cannot occur, and sort of some of your possibilities might involve infinites, because they can occur, we have to conclude that there was a start. I feel like your possibilities have not teased out this sort of, or ironed this out. Was there an actual beginning to the universe in any of your theories? Or does there need to be, and how would you deal with eternal?
So even with the Big Bang, it doesn't necessarily follow that there's a beginning. But there could be a beginning. Abdullah said the buck stops somewhere. And I think the buck could stop at nothing. It is possible that the universe came from nothing. Because what do we know about nothing? We look around and there is no nothing. And I said earlier in this debate, everyone looks around and they say, why is there something rather than nothing? But just as profound a question is, why is there not nothing? It could be, despite the assertion that something can't come from nothing, it could be that all nothing does is create things, which is why we never see it. It could be that the beginning of the universe was nothing, but that nothings create something. Maybe that's what they do. We don't know. We don't have a nothing to study. But a lot of my theories don't rely on that. A lot of them are. Some of them are where the universe is literally eternal, where it goes on forever. But the reason I like the analogy with the ball and the fifth dimension is because we can see a basketball. We know that it is finite. But on a two-dimensional plane, a basketball is infinite. It goes all the way around, and it would seem infinite to a dot on a basketball. But it's not. And it could be that there are other dimensions, other multiverses and such, which make our finite universe infinite to us.
Again, a lot of assertions, a lot of fanciful models without actual evidence. To be frank, again, still not engaging with the deductive argument and sort of prancing around. Is there prancing around potential models without providing any evidence or substantiating them at all, and then saying, "Oh, I'm not making a claim. I'm making a claim, but I'm not making a claim. I'm just carefully, throwing questions around." I don't think that's a really if, on the assumption of not engaging with the content. I really don't think that's a sort of the best approach to take with this discussion, just because it ends up you're not telling a story and then potentially describing certain potential scenarios without falsifying any of them, or falsifying the one posited by the one that I presented this evening. So making a claim, but low-key not making a claim. How do you respond to that? I mean, like we need to have a conversation, and we need to engage with each other's points. I'm really trying to engage with you, Mr. Cox, and it's just not happening for some reason.
Okay, can we engage then?
Lovely.
So you said I'm not making an argument for any of these cases. I want to know what you think my kind of philosophical arguments for are these possible are. I want to know what you think of the kind of arguments about, well, black holes can't destroy matter, so the matter must go somewhere. If these aren't arguments, if philosophical and possibilities aren't arguments, then what does that make of your argument, which is based entirely on philosophy?
So the thing, Mr. Cox, is that you assume the existence of something in order to explain everything else. So a black hole is a something, a white hole is a something, gravity is something. All these things are assuming an existence of something to then explain the existence of other things, right? Whether even if it is a law of the universe, whether it's a thing that we know, these aren't creative forces. They're descriptive laws. So in all these models, you're assuming a thing, and nevertheless, Mr. Cox, please find one. Give me one example and demonstrate the evidence of one of those models. Take one at random, and let's engage on any one of those.
Just before you do that, so I'm going to make this the last sort of exchange, and I think the sort of resounding, at least from this exchange, is that how would you take both of your arguments from possibility to truth? So these are possibilities, it seems, and sort of how would you take this possibility to something that you should believe in, or something that should be accepted? So I'll let both of you engage that, and then we'll have Q&A.
Okay, well, in terms of taking this as something to truth and proving these possible arguments, I think that one could do that. We could look into a black hole and see if that leads to another universe. There are instruments that are testing for other dimensions. Like I said, not a physicist, not pretending to understand it, but there are ways that these things could be detected, and we are working on testing these things. We're not really working on testing God. One of the things mentioned earlier by Abdullah was Occam's razor, which is this idea that the simplest thing is the most likely explanation. And it's a bit of a mischaracterization. What is meant by the word simplest there is the thing which makes the least assumptions. And that's what Abdullah is talking about here, that I'm assuming something to explain something. But with regards to the black hole example, what am I assuming? We know black holes to exist. We know our universe to have an origin, and that it explodes out, and that it looks exactly like a black hole in reverse, that has this exponential kind of growth. There isn't anything which doesn't exist which I'm assuming. The only thing that's being assumed is the connection. But it's not assuming a new something. And it's very ironic because the whole idea of God assumes God. We had this point before that the whole thing about why the cause of the universe is important is because of the question why. But that assumes a why. In all of these arguments, there's an assumption. Infinities can't exist. There's a why to the universe, a creator to the universe, that there is a God. All of these are things which we don't know to be true. But what we do know to be true is that there is black holes, and there is a kind of coming together of the universe. And so we can make a connection there. We also know that when you zoom into atoms and quarks, that those are like their own little universes. And then when you zoom out into solar systems and then galaxies and cosmos and everything like that, that those look surprisingly like atoms. So a lot of these theories, whilst they might seem fanciful, are based on observation. They're not based on whole cloth.
Okay.
The reason why I started with first principles is to assume the absolute least. Yeah, so we can start with basically from the first principle, and we don't assume anything except for the very, very valid assumption of cause and effect. That's essentially probably the only assumption there, that something, a cause, has an effect. Right? There's a causal relationship, which is fundamentally the whole point of the scientific method is to investigate the relationship of cause and effect. And so that's the reason why I started with the first principles. And to take this from possibility to truth is essentially using our rational faculty, the whole faculty that determines our understanding of truth, and to go through an intellectual process of defining that. And that's why I started with a rational argument, a rational deductive argument. We're here to make a rational, a reasonable, an intelligent case for each of our positions. And I feel like I did that, or I made a case for one that hasn't really been engaged with. But I think that answers the question.
Okay, sure. I'm going to have 10 minutes for Q&A. I'm probably going to take like 2 or 3 questions. I don't know if we can take 4 questions. Any from the floor?
I got one. I just had a question for you, just to get your opinion on something. Earlier on in the debate, you mentioned that Islam is the most scientific, most beautiful, most refined religion. Is that to say, out of all the world's religions that you've seen or studied, assuming the premise that God exists, that in your opinion, Islam is the religion that is closest to the truth, or explains the truth best, or explains God the best?
I said it might be. I have had... Islam's probably the religion that I've had the second most exposure to. So I went to an Anglican high school, and obviously we live in a predominantly Christian society. But after that, it's probably been Islam. And Islam is one of the modern religions. It's one that's lasted the test of time. So certainly it has to be somewhat scientific, somewhat beautiful, somewhat profound to survive that. Like I said, the other religions died away. But it's also new enough to have addressed some of the problems from the other Abrahamic religions before it, which of course you find problematic. And although I haven't read all of the Quran or anything like that, like I said, it might be the best iteration of the invisible gardener. It might be the closest to science, the most beautifully written of all the scriptures. But even that alone wouldn't make it divine. Just like before Islam, Christianity being the most scientific, the most beautiful and everything at that time, doesn't make it the truth.
Okay. Any other question? Yep.
How's it going? Okay, so I have a question for Abdullah. So basically what we've been going around is how to argue the deductive reasoning for the concept of God and why God exists. So personally I'm unaware how one would be able to argue a deductive argument, so I'll pose an example. If people need to know, like, deductive argument just means that its conclusion is supported by the assumption. So basically it would be like saying, John is a man, all men wear socks, therefore John wears socks. I would argue that if you mean to argue the deductive argument, would you mean that whether this nebulous sort of John exists, or whether he's a man, or whether he wears socks? I just wanted maybe a form of clarification, if that's alright, how one would...
So with the deductive argument, as opposed to an inductive argument, they're the two general ways of argumentation. And a deductive argument is the strongest form of argumentation because the premises, so long as the premises are true, the conclusion must follow, right? Must follow. And the premises that I put forward was in two phases. The first one being that an actual infinite cannot exist. There was and an infinite history of past events is an actual infinite. So therefore, an infinite history of past events cannot exist. And therefore, the universe is finite. And therefore, the universe had a beginning. So yes, the conclusion relies upon the initial premises. But so long as those premises are true, the conclusion necessarily follows and is true as well. So that's just how deductive arguments work. As opposed to inductive arguments, where you take a bunch of general observations and then you try and bring a unifying conclusion or theory around them, right? So I purposely chose a deductive argument because it's the strongest form of reasoning, and that's the whole reason I employed that particular process.
Okay. Good question. Yep. Congratulations to both of you. I have a question for both of you, especially for Abdul, because he was the one who opened the debate. I'm intrigued to know why you needed to touch the topic of universe in order to justify the existence of God.
There's many arguments that you can make, and I took a particular approach. For example, different theologians and philosophers made arguments from, for example, like I did with contingency argument. You can make an ontological argument, you can make a moral argument. There's a range of approaches one can take. But I wanted to start with first principles, so we can have this discussion and engage at the very fundamental level. And so that's why I brought in the discussion about the origin of the universe. Right? We're not assuming anything. We're simply asking a question that people have asked themselves since existence. Yeah. So it's an age-old question that we can engage with on a sort of a universal axiom using our mind, our reasoning, and critical thinking. And that's the reason I presented that particular discussion. I didn't go into sort of theories or sociological phenomena about religions in general and that sort of stuff.
Okay. Was that one question?
Well, I can ask another one if you want me to.
No. Would you like to Thomas to respond to that? Because it was a question on Abdullah's approach.
It's a really good point. I think my problem with this argument is even if you take that deductive argument, you get to the end and then it's just the universe has to have a beginning. We haven't gotten to God. You can say that's a creator, and like I said, you can put the God label on it, but we've just got to a beginning. And like I said, that beginning could be nothing. It could be that nothings create somethings. And like Abdullah said, that would still have a lot of the same characteristics. It would still be eternal. It created everything, so you could still call it omnipotent if you wanted to. The fact that you can get to a beginning doesn't get you to God.
Okay, final question.
Thanks for both the speakers. So just very quickly, you mentioned, Mr. Cox, that some things can come from nothing. So can you just give a brief explanation or a description of how something can arise from nothing?
Not really. It's just that there's this assertion in the argument and an implication in the argument that something cannot come from nothing. We don't know that to be true. And we talked before about how everything must have a cause and an effect. And this has generally been true of the macro universe that we've observed around us. But we were talking about science, and precisely what science has found in the last decades is quantum physics, where causes follow effects. You have an effect, and then you have a cause. And so we could have that with the universe as well, where the universe comes into being and then has an effect that follows it. It doesn't make sense on our macro understanding of physics, but that is what we found to be true of quantum physics, and we don't know what the physical laws of the universe were in the earliest stages. And it could also be, like the ball analogy, that it comes all the way back around on itself, that the cause of the universe is the universe, that it's just internally consistent and goes all the way around.
I just have another question on that.
No more questions, sorry. I'm just like out of time. Sorry. Okay, sorry for that. We're just running out of time. Abdullah actually has to go catch a flight, so I'm trying to be as conscious of time as I can. I'm going to give each speaker 2 minutes closing remarks, after which we will end the night. I'll give the first one to Abdullah just because he wanted to respond in part to that question.
Okay, I'll quickly touch on that one. Dumping quantum physics is a bit of a cheeky little red herring sometimes, because without any explanation of quantum physics, it sounds really cool and really interesting and intelligent, doesn't it? So very cheeky and slightly cocky. So the way with quantum physics, it simply presents an indeterministic view of reality. It doesn't negate causation. It just means that causation exists through a spectrum of possibilities. I'm not sure exactly what he's affirming in terms of quantum physics making a difference to this argument. In fact, it probably supports the argument in many ways, because purely because of the indeterministic nature of that particular model. And nevertheless, things don't pop out of nothing in that way. There's still a fluctuation of energy on the quantum level, right? So the quantum model is a bit cheeky, and I won't repeat that second one. And so to conclude, this is an incredibly important. I know sometimes this discussion can feel a bit abstract, right? We're having this discussion about science and existence and these fundamental philosophical questions that, you know what does it matter? How does it matter to me? Yeah, but these questions are fundamental to our purpose, who we are, and why we're here, right? And they need to be engaged with and critically reflected upon. Critical reflection is a huge theme in the Islamic tradition. These discussions, engagements with atheists, other faiths, questioning, even to the point of questioning one's own existence. This is rich within the Islamic tradition. This is not a new discussion or a new enlightened discussion that sometimes is presented that Muslims are having. The theology and the dialogue is as deep as it is rich, and I think any investigation in that will reveal that. So we really need to ask these questions and think on a purely rational and using our mind, logic, and reason. Right? I'm not postulating stories. I'm not postulating sci-fi philosophy or anything like that. I'm asking you to think, and there's a strong rational foundation, and we don't even like to use the term faith. This is rational conviction that satisfies both the heart and the mind. And my task today, I feel, was to demonstrate that the Islamic conception of God is yes, that He does exist, and yes, that it follows. The Islamic conception of God follows from that model, and I felt like I did that, or I demonstrated a case for that, and that should really have profound implications to our current thinking, and as well as how we move forward in the future.
So the relevance of the quantum physics was just to say that it need not be something from nothing. It might be that the cause comes after the creation of the universe, that there might still be a cause. I could be really cheeky and also talk about string theory and how the cause could come from another dimension and things like that, but I won't do it. Don't worry. So what? That would be too cheeky of me. So in my opening address, I talked about the possibility that God could not exist, and I talked about the idea of God and whether or not it's comprehensive. I don't think we've seen too much talk about that, and I would have liked to have spent more time talking about it. Instead, what we spent a lot of time talking about was the origins of the universe. We were meant to be presented with an argument for why God must exist. But at the very best, even if we took all the premises and the conclusion, accepted all of them, we get a beginning. Okay, the plants must come from somewhere, but why does it have to be a gardener? The plants in that jungle could come from anywhere. And I gave you numerous other ways in which the universe could come about, and there's countless other examples that I can't think of, that Abdullah can't think of, that every scientist working on all these theories, and they have hundreds or thousands of theories, that they haven't thought of. The idea that we can think beyond the imagination of nature and the universe and propose that they can only come from God, only come from a thing which we can imagine, is arrogance. Some of those theories have a beginning. Some of those theories are completely consistent with what Abdullah's argument is. Some of those theories have a beginning and have the universe coming into being, sometimes out of nothing, sometimes from something else, like a God, like another dimension, like another universe. But many of these premises don't even hold up. The idea that the infinite cannot exist, and yet God can exist. The idea that history must be infinite, when it need not be infinite. It might, in fact, have a stopping point. Either way, the questions over the origin of the universe remain a question. And the fact that there's still a question mark over that means we can't say that God did it. we would need proof of God first before we could say that God created the universe. To insist on the God as the creation of the universe is to beg the question, is to assume your answer in your premises. And you can't do that in philosophy. You can't do that in science. You can't assume that the only answer could be God.
That marks the end of the night. I'd like to thank both of the speakers, and in sort of light of that, the Muslim Students Association has sort of put something together for you guys. Thank you, Abdullah. Thank you, Thomas.
Thank you.
And I think that's sort of the end of the night. I'd like to thank everyone for coming. I'd like to thank the Muslim Students Association for putting this together. If I'm not mistaken, there's still some of Islamic Awareness Week left in the next day or so. So please have a look on the Facebook and see what's happening. Otherwise, thank you to the speakers, and thank you all for coming. I hope you all learned a lot. I definitely did. And yeah, we'll end on that. Assalamu alaikum.